Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to do a very short introduction to classification models and how they are done in R. And so we're not going to go over any specific models here, but we're just going to talk about what is classification and sort of why would we be interested in using something else other than linear regression. So first, we ask the sort of obvious question, what is classification? Because all that we've done so far in the class has been regression, which is where we have predictors and we are trying to model the response based on a set of predictors, which is also what we're doing in classification. But for regression, we have a quantitative response. And when we move from a quantitative response to a categorical response, then we move from regression to classification. So classification is trying to place an observation into one of several different categories, or I'll often call them classes, based on values of the predictors. So essentially, I'm still using my predictors to correlate with the response or look how those predictors help explain the response, but now my response is categorical, and so things have to change. So what kind of examples or questions might I ask? And so these are just 3 from our book, ISLR, but I think they're good ones to think about. So a person arrives at the emergency room with some symptoms, and we determine that those symptoms could be attributed to one of 3 medical conditions, and so the question is, which one of those 3 does the individual have? Okay. Online banking services often must determine whether or not a transaction being performed on a site is fraudulent. So just fraudulent or not on the basis of the user's IP address, past transaction history, and many and lots of other data that the banking service will have on that person. And then 3, on the basis of DNA sequence data for a number of different patients with and without a given disease. A biologist would like to figure out which DNA mutations are disease causing and which are not. Okay? And so you'll notice that sometimes there may be 2 outcomes, and we'll call that a binary response. And then there's sometimes we might have more than 2, such as the first example here, and we'll have different sort of terminology for those. Okay, and so to introduce these topics, I'm going to use a data set, the same data set throughout, that'll give us some consistency. And there's a new data set that was actually sort of curated in 2019 or late 2018, so really recently. And it's a really cool data set on some penguins, and it's called the Palmer penguins data. Okay, and so it's a new data set about 3 different species of penguins in Antarctica. And the 3 penguin species are the Adelaide, the Chinstrap, and the Gentoo. Right, and so there are 3 different species, and so the idea is going to be based on a number of different measurements and other data about these penguins. We're going to try to place the penguins into the 3 species. And so we're going to try to figure out what makes each species unique. Is there things that we can tell them apart by? Okay? And so the predictors, or rather the whole data, are this. And so we've got 7 predictors and a response. The response that makes the most sense is, of course, the species. And then we have data on which island they were found on. So there are a number of islands in which they were taken. Their bill length and bill depth. Also their flipper length, their body mass, their sex, and then the study year. So which year was the penguin taken. Right. I believe I mentioned this on the first couple days of class, but this is a nice data set to do classification stuff with. Right. And so let's take a look at the data and see if classification will sort of, I want to say make sense, but if we look at a picture, we'll try to be able to gain an understanding of what we're trying to do. okay, for lack of better terms. And so here's a picture of flipper length, body mass, and then the species of the penguins. Okay, and so if we just plot the flipper length on the x-axis, the body mass on the y-axis, and then we color and change the shape of the points, it gives us this picture, which is I don't know, a pretty stark picture, or it's a picture that tells us a lot. Okay, flipper length and body mass, and so we can see just right away that the classes, so we'll often call them classes, the levels of the response variable, there's a clear pattern going on here. And the pattern is that the Gentoo penguins, the blue squares, are separate or separable from the other two. So it looks like Gentoo penguins have longer flippers and way more than the other two penguins, by far. And so the classification task that we're trying to do is to try to cut these data points up. Or that's what our models are going to do, is create boundaries in which if you're on one side of the boundary, then you're going to be classified as whatever points, and if you're on the other side or you're in another boundary, then you'll be classified as something different. And so in this picture, it would be pretty simple for you to draw a line, and you say everything to the right of that line is going to be a Gentoo penguin, and then we're not really sure about the left-hand side. And that classifier that you just made, a simple decision if it was on one side or the other of a line, is actually going to do fairly well for here. And so classification is basically you're going to draw some lines on this graph to split up the points into the different species. And as the models get more complex, the lines that you draw may no longer be lines, may be quite weirdly shaped, right? But they're going to still create boundaries in which if you lay on one side of the boundary, then you're going to be classified as one thing. If you lay on the other side, you may be classified as something else. Okay. The moneymaker, or the reason why this is an interesting problem, is that the green triangles and the red dots are not separated, or they are not separable. And so trying to optimally split up those is sort of a more interesting problem that the classification models that we're going to use try to do. Okay, so the question that most people ask when you have this kind of data is, why not use linear regression? So we know linear regression, it works well for a lot of things, it's really simple, and so it's natural for us to think, why not linear regression? And simply, it's not appropriate because the response variable is categorical. Okay, and so on the sort of moral high ground stance, that's why linear regression isn't appropriate. But we have to think of it also practically. Why does it not make sense? Because, as I've said a bunch of times in the course, that sometimes you may have things that may not theoretically make sense, but if in practice they work well, maybe we should use them. So if linear regression would work well in these circumstances, even though it's technically, it doesn't meet the assumptions of linear regression, it may still be useful to use, but it turns out not to be. And so if we go back to my one example, when I have a patient incoming with a number of symptoms, and then I'm trying to see what kind of disease they might have or what happened to them. Okay, they might have three different things happening, either a stroke, a drug overdose, or an epileptic seizure. And so I can code them, or I can encode them as 1, 2, and 3. So I can't plot stroke, drug overdose, and epileptic seizure. because they aren't numbers, but I could assign them numbers, which is often what people do to categorical variables. Okay, so for instance, if you have a survey that asks you if you strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree, that's a categorical variable, but people will often assign the values, say 1 through 5, for those 5 categories, and then try to use those numbers to do their analysis with, which is a bad idea. And so here we can assign 1, 2, and 3 to stroke, drug overdose, and epileptic seizure. But what that does, if I encode it like that, is it puts a strict ordering on the levels of the response. Okay, meaning that somehow drug overdose is 1 away from a stroke. So it's important. Quantitative and categorical variable distinguishing stuff is important. And the way to distinguish a quantitative versus categorical variable is that quantitative variables have units associated with them. And so a difference of 1 in my y has some sort of meaning. Okay, you're 1 pound heavier, or you're 1 inch taller, or your blood pressure is up by 1. Okay, different examples like that. But here, 2 is 1 away from 1, but does that have any meaning? So it means that here the ordering says that, drug overdose is 1 away from stroke, and epileptic seizure is 1 away from drug overdose. And you may even have to say that, like, an epileptic seizure is worse than a drug overdose, which is worse than a stroke. And so that would be irresponsible for me to do, because I don't know that sort of ordering or that leveling between drug overdose and epileptic seizure. And so it would be irresponsible for me to put that ordering on them. And so because of that reason, and so that's, again, a theoretical reason, but in practice, just fitting a line to this kind of thing just doesn't work, okay, because it doesn't form a linear relationship. So for both practical and theoretical reasons, we need other methods to handle this better. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about on Friday is our first one. And our first one is going to have to do with binary responses. So as I said before, for categorical responses, I could have a categorical variable with, 2 levels. So in this example here, the penguins are either female or male. And so if I was looking to predict the sex of a penguin, female or male, then that would be a binary response. Okay, but if I was predicting the species, there are 3 possible responses, so that wouldn't be binary. And so we're going to first learn about methods for binary responses, and then we'll work up to methods for more than 2 classes of categorical variables. So here I have a nice picture for each of the penguins. I want to look at the body mass and the flipper length, which is sort of what we saw before, but I'm adding in a 4th variable, which is the sex. And so as you see, it's probably fairly separable, especially for the chinstrap penguins and the Gentoo penguins, that males are larger and have longer flipper length. Actually, I have 2 different variables here that I've added. I've added sex and bill length. And so you see that they are fairly separable. The question is, how do we make the line to say, if you're on one side of the line, you're something, and you're on the other side of the line, you're something else. Okay? And so we're going to start, we're going to start with something called logistic regression. Okay? And so by Friday, I'll have my slide transitions better than they were here. But that's where we'll start, is logistic regression on Friday. So I'll see you then.